know this at that time any more than anybody does, but the result is that the civilian leadership looked bad, and they couldn't handle the economic stuff right, so the military starts to assert themselves. Okay? And the Japanese Constitution was based on the Bismarck Constitution. So the Army is an independent unit of the government. The Army isn't under control of the government. The Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, as we would call it, were military officers. In the U.S., this is a no-no, correct? Secretary of Defense has to be a civilian. When Colin Powell wanted to be Secretary of State, I forget, when Marshall wanted to be Secretary of Defense under Truman, the Congress had to pass a special law. It's a one-time deal. We don't want the military stays in the military. The civilian job is to do the civilian. And Japan and Germany never had that, and it caused them a lot of trouble. And so these guys started saying, we're in charge, we're taking over. And China, at this time, is still very weak, and China's going through all kind of turmoil. And the result is that the Japanese army in China takes over gigantic Manchuria in 1931. I think this is famous for, like the Germans call Lebensraum, because Manchuria is like 10 times the size of China, of Japan, maybe more. Manchuria is the size of Texas, California, Italy, and plus more. It's very large, as you can sort of see over there. And the Chinese just did a coup, the Japanese, and they took it over. This is naked aggression. No, they didn't do it without any excuse or anything like that. And the result is that the League of Nations got all upset. And here, take a look at the next item. It's very famous. The League of Nations couldn't do anything. Matsoko was the Japanese ambassador. And he quits when the League of Nations voted against him. Can we make it a little louder?
Post-war history. The League of Nations meets at Geneva to vote on the report holding Japan responsible for the conflict with China over Manchuria. Before the vote is
Pay attention to this guy because he's going to be important.
delivers a final address on his country's behalf.
China has long been very weak in her international duties as a sovereign state, and Japan, as her nearest neighbor, has been the greatest sufferer on that score. The adoption of this report would give the impression to the Chinese that they have been exonerated from all responsibility, that they could continue to defy Japan with impunity. It will serve further to embitter the feelings of the Japanese and Chinese peoples.
That's it. You get the idea. The Matsuoka will become the most important Japanese diplomat. He will sign the treaty with Hitler, and he'll be a very good friend of the Jewish people. This is the Orient. You can't go by the regular. Now, what should the world do about this? Or more specifically, what should the U.S. do? That's the other big country. At that time, president in 1930 was Hoover. The Secretary of State was Hoover. And there's Henry Stimson, the very famous Secretary of State, once upon a time, and a very well-known statesman and all that business. And what are you supposed to do about this? What, the Japanese just defied international law and took over a country. What should we do? Hoover and Stimson had four options how to react to the invasion and the annexation of Manchuria. Number one, they could do like Teddy Roosevelt and say, listen, let's just recognize that it's a fact, and we can't do nothing about it. And it's like Korea, you know what I mean? In other words, better than a war. That's one way of looking at it. Number two, they could go to war. Number three, they can make economic sanctions. See, well, we won't allow Japan to buy from us or sell from us. Or you can go number four, which is what they did, which is we say we don't recognize what you did. We declare it illegal. Like the U.S. and the other countries do about Israel today in the Shtachim. Right? They say we're not going to do nothing about you, but we want you to know we don't agree that Israel has the right to East Jerusalem. As you know, right? We don't agree Israel has the right to make the settlements. This is the Obama administration, for example. That's what they ended up doing, called the Stimson Doctrine, and which is that the United States officially dissed Japan. They said, we think you did something wrong. And when you officially come out before Hesia and you say, I think the other country is committing aggression, it's very insulting to the other country. And it made tense and abnormal relations for the rest of the decade. Because whatever happens between America and Japan, the Japanese know that in American eyes they're doing something illegal. Now, Herbert Hoover was a great man, even though people don't think so. And he saw it in very strategic, interesting terms. And what he thought was, let's go to the next map. Yeah, he said, you have to look at the world picture. Hoover had lived around the world. If you ever study him, and he was a guy born without, his family support didn't have shoes. He became a multimillionaire by being the first graduate from Stanford in engineering, and he worked in engineering things around the world. I mean, he was quite an interesting person. And he understood the international situation from a certain point of view. And he said, look at Asia. There's Japan, there's Russia. Again, there's Japan, there's Russia. Okay? Under Stalin, Russia is a threat. Japan is not a threat to the United States. Even if they would declare war on us, which they're not going to do, but even if they declare war, they can't conquer America. They just don't have it. Russia is a threat. Hoover was always afraid throughout his lifetime, and when he was president, of communism and everything going along with that. Who gains from a war with Japan? If we go to war with Japan over Manchuria, who gains from that? Not the Manchurians, and not the Japanese, and not the Americans, the Russians. You get it? That's how he's thinking. So you have to think in balance of power terms. And the one thing you want to make sure of is we don't do anything that makes Stalin stronger, because he's next to Alaska. And Stalin, as Hoover understood it, and he was correct, would like to take over the world. Okay? He's too clever to say it with favors, but he would like to take the world. So that's what you got to watch out for. And so he applied old-fashioned common sense balance of power strategy. The worst case scenario for U.S. interests would be a strong Russia in Asia, better a strong Japan. Now, the situation in general, Hoover realized, was out of whack because, let's go back one. The map. Yeah. Ordinarily, the way it is today, by the way, today's way is at this moment, my friend, there is a balance of power in North Asia, for better or worse. Russia is strong, America is strong, China is strong, Japan is strong. And between these four, it's never 100% equal, but it's no war. Because they're all powerful. And that's the way the geography indicates it should be. At the time I'm talking about, this was abnormal. Giant China, which was very weak. So that created imbalance in the power situation. And that caused a lot of trouble. Now, China was, as they say, dysfunctional. There's Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong want to kill each other. In the end, the communists do take over and turn China into a communist country, as we know, but that's 20 years away. And since Japan can't invade America, a strong, though non-aggressive Japan is better for America as opposed to Russia. One day, Hoover says Japan will get out of Manchuria. It won't last. This was the lodestar of his philosophy and others like him. Above all, be worried about Russia, 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 Russia. And you and I know, because of the Cold War, that he was 100% right. Okay? In other words, in retrospect, no question that he was right. Now, Hoover, I might say, Herbert Hoover was a bitter anti-communist. He knew the communists very well from the time of Lenin and the Great Famine. People may not know this, but there's a Russian, that's a picture I can show you. When the communists took over and they had the Civil War in the early 1920s, 6 million people in Western Russia died from starvation, plain and simple. There was no food. It's when Lenin took over. And Lenin, although he hated America and capitalism, he begged Herbert Hoover, who was in charge of the food in America, please send food over here, and Hoover did. You understand? It's one of the famous things that he did. But in order to do so, Hoover went to Russia, negotiated with the Russians. He said, I'll do it, but I want my American workers to distribute food my way or the highway. And he negotiated very hard with them, and he got his way. And so he did save the Russians. But he knew who they are. And he knew they're a bunch of banditin, as they say. But all this changed a year and a half later when Hoover left office, because he was blown out of office because of the Depression, and FDR came in. Okay? There's the day that he comes over. Roosevelt was a completely different person, and he's going to be the guy for the rest of our talk, just about. FDR was a very different person in many ways. Now, a very interesting person, obviously. First of all, he was a Navy man. He used to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for 8 years, under Wilson, for 8 years. So that was number 2 in Navy departments. He understood naval stuff. He was in love with that kind of business. And he watched the Japanese, but he famously said like this, speak softly and build 5 to 3. 5 ships to there every 3. And right away, it was the Depression, you know this, when he came in, and there was no money to be had, but he insisted he put aside some money for 2 aircraft carriers. It's the beginning of the American aircraft getting ready. It was Enterprise and the Hornet, I think, or something like that, or the Lexington, the famous names from later on, because he wasn't stupid, okay? On the other hand, a lot of people, by the way, didn't see that The period I'm talking about was still the machlokes in the Navy between the old and the new. The old officers, which was 90%, 95%, said the battleships is the way to go. The airplanes and aircraft carriers, they can't sink a heavy battleship. As we all know, Billy Mitchell was court-martialed because he said, you can sink any battleship in the world. Actually, the United States should never build another ship. Just little destroyers to help the carriers around. Don't waste your time. And that was so, again, culture is the enemy, isn't that true? Culture is the enemy. Because in World War II, we went only with the carriers, not with the battleships. They didn't do anything. But anyhow, at that time, there was a tension between Japan and Russia. Listen closely. And it was a good chance that Japan was going to go to war with Russia. I won't go into the reasons why. Stalin, therefore, said like this: in order to balance the stakes and help us out, we need to establish friendship with America. That was a completely cynical reason. The U.S. did not have diplomatic relations with Russia. When the communists took over, it was Woodrow Wilson, and he said the communists, like I said, a bunch of banditin, they don't keep their international word, they won't pay their debts, and this and that and the other. They're going to spy on us and bring communist propaganda, every bit of which is true. And so I don't want to have nothing to do with them. And Harding and Coolidge and Hoover would not have any official diplomatic relations with Russia. What do we want to bring a bunch of spies here for? And, Deborah diplomats will run around, they won't let ours do anything over there, all of which was true. But Roosevelt didn't see it that way. Stalin had a very clever spy system, the best. And he was able to use U.S. opinion makers to get to Roosevelt. And so here's the famous Walter Duranty, infamous, I should say. Walter Duranty, he was the New York Times correspondent in Russia. He was a Stalin lover. He said, I guess, there's no famine here in Russia. Everything's great. This is what he wrote in the New York Times. You understand? You can look him up. As a matter of fact, there's a movement now in the Pulitzer Prize world to take away his Pulitzer Prize. And here's Senator Bora, who was the leading Republican senator from the Midwest. And he was basically saying like this: I have farmers, this is depression. If Russia is starving, we'll sell them wheat. He's saying that's what counts. So let's make a treaty, let's make a thing with Russia. So between the two of them and some others, Roosevelt was persuaded there'll be a good idea to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and he did so in 1933 in the first year of his office. And he said that he made Russia promise they won't spy on us. He made Russia promise that they'll have freedom of religion. I mean, you can read it. It's unbelievable, And the Russians, by the way, say, I swear to God. No problem. You understand? And there's no problem. And now, incidentally, if you want a Jewish angle in all this Senator Bora was therefore somebody that Stalin liked because he was useful to his purposes. 3 years after this, there was a Jewish rabbi in Idaho, because he was from Idaho, who said, I have a relative in Russia, I want you to help him get him out. Nobody gets out of Stalin's Russia. But Bora says to the Soviet ambassador, he said, well, do me a personal favor. And the Soviet ambassador said, for you, we'll do any personal favor. Moshe Feinstein. That's how he got out. Yeah. So now, as Paul Harvey says, now, from person, of course, will say like this: it was meant by the Ban Shalom, the Senator Bora, whatever. Now, here's the problem. The Russians promised they wouldn't spy and steal all, but of course they're total liars. Roosevelt brought in the New Deal, as you know. The New Deal brought in at least 1,000, probably thousands, of idealistic lawyers. I mean this. Idealistic lawyers from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Penn, Columbia, and all over the place, when it come to reform the country and change it radically. And it needed a lot of reforms. Remember, at the time I'm talking about, the banks could do whatever they want until the government started regulating them. That's why there was a problem with the Depression. There was no Security and Exchange Commission. I mean, there was a lot of things that really needed to be done. There were also things that didn't need to be done. This is the machlokas between the conservatives and the liberals down till today. But nevertheless, it was a golden era for, as they say, lawyers and these types, including a ton of Jews. That's how the Jews got in the federal government, to be perfectly honest. You understand? Because they needed, in fact, Roosevelt even said, I want you to go to Manhattan, the Lower East Side, and Brooklyn, and find me a whole bunch of young, budding Thomas Jeffersons, I think he said, and so forth. Because he was the governor of New York, he understood. And so they brought in a ton of these guys. Many of them were Talmudim of Felix Frankfurt at Harvard and places like that. And they were just liberal, idealistic, young American lawyers, liberals. It was a golden age of liberalism. Roosevelt administered the most liberal administration, or used to be thought of that way. And wait a second. A lot of them are communists, or communist sympathizers, or Marxists of one kind or another. But Roosevelt, unlike Hoover, was just built very differently. He said like this, communism is just a very strong liberal. It's no big deal. You get it? I don't believe in communism, and he didn't. And I'm not in favor, and I don't want to bring Russia over here, but the communists are the only ones who are for the civil rights, which was the case. They were the ones fighting for the Negroes. The communists are the ones fighting for the poor farmers. Communists fighting for the labor unions. So they're just very strong New Dealers. You understand? That's how he saw it. As a result, the New Deal made karka basula for Soviet infiltration, penetration. Okay? I mean, it was just full of, these are all spies. These are Alger Hiss, you've heard of, City College in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University, Harvard Law School, clerk for Holmes. And then went on to this big career, became number 5 in the State Department. He was a communist spy. Lachlan Curry, these two people are not Jewish. He's not Jewish. Duggan, he becomes a big macher advisor to the State Department in Asian policy. Lee Pressman, obviously, you can tell by the name, is Jewish. The whole Washington is full of these guys. You don't notice them unless you notice them. Okay? Now I'm going to say something you're going to think is funny, and I don't exactly mean it to be funny, although it's amusing. If you understand this is Jewish history too, unfortunately. He says, if you know the culture of the Marxism, they have kiruv also. And they have a lot of shiurim and chaburas. And they meet in people's houses, and the wife serves cookies and things like this. And they darshan Marxism. Knows how do you interpret what's going on in the world through the lens of a Marxist interpretation, and was Roosevelt doing the right thing or not? And of course, Russia is the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and Stalin is the highest person in the world. They're not interested in what's the real Russia. They want the Russia in their faith. You understand? So take a look, for example, here's Whittaker Chambers, who later confessed and so to speak came out, and he said, I went the atmosphere in FDR. He went to an apartment. There were 60 or 7 others at the Shear. Pressman didn't know them all, neither did I. They're all dues-paying members of the Communist Party. All of them were employed in the U.S. government, high position, Agriculture Department, Justice Department, Interior, NLRB, Agriculture, the Railroad Retirement Board, and so on and so forth. You understand? They're coming together for a Thursday night Shear in the Parsha Shavua, the Parsha of Marx. And no, it was a whole atmosphere. And Roosevelt knew, he didn't know, he didn't care. And so what I'm trying to say is like this. It was a happy hunting ground for Soviet intelligence, unfortunately. They had not one, but 100 spies, 200 spies, 300 spies, maybe more. And in very important positions, they knew everything about us. Here was the head of the Soviet intelligence, Akhmarov. The U.S. government didn't even know he was there, and he was running all over the United States. We didn't have at that time an FBI that was organized to fight Soviet, spies. They weren't thinking in those terms. You understand? The Russians were light years ahead of us. We were not even in diapers. You understand? And it is what it is. And the Russians owned. This guy was a Jewish congressman. Dickstein belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. He was a communist spy. You understand? For the NKVD. I'll say it again. A member of the United States Congress. And he started the House on Un-American Activities Committee. Right? But no, I'm going to tell you right now. He meant it. Wait a second. He started under orders from Stalin. Okay? He meant it to investigate the Nazis. Because I'm not talking about that tonight. But under Roosevelt, Hitler took over, then you had a problem with the Nazi spies and the Nazi fifth columnists. That's true. And that's what he had in mind. And for a year or two, that's what they did. But then he was pushed out, and the guy who took over him, a congressman from Texas, he said, forget the Nazis, I'm interested in the Reds. You see? And then he said, oh, no, you can't do that. But they did it. As you know, and then the House of Un-American Committee, of course, became famous for that. Roosevelt, as I said before, doesn't know, doesn't care. He's very tolerant towards the Reds. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, her social circle was all full of people that were half communists, 100% communists, 3/4 communists. That's what, because she said like this, these are people who help me fight for the workers and fight for the labor unions, which is true, okay? and helped this legislation, all the rest of it. And it never occurred to her, because she was a starry-eyed idealist, never occurred that they're really sending secret messages and spy things, to the Soviets. And I tell you the truth, in the 1930s, she probably figured like this. And if they do, big deal. Russia's not that bad. Right? I'm trying to take you into a mentality. It doesn't exist now, but it existed then. And this is the world at that time. Martin Tice was the Texas guy who took over, was a super anti-communist, almost like a fascist. And he went to Roosevelt. Roosevelt said, "What are you bugging the communists for? Some of them are bad, but most of them are just nice guys. They're just a little bit too, meshuggah on the liberalism." That's what he said, a little bit too meshuggah on liberalism, but they're not really bad. And then Martin Tice said this, and they had a lot of fights. And so the Roosevelt administration, unfortunately, was shot through with Russian spies and agents of influence, and sometimes both. I don't believe this, but the Russians say that Harry Hopkins was a spy of theirs. Okay? Harry Hopkins, as I'm sure many know, was Roosevelt's right-hand man down till his death. I mean, he was at the very top of World War II. Okay? He did all the stuff. And like I said before, I can't believe it, not because I'm being shocked, but it doesn't make any sense to me. But they say it, not me. The KGB has given shiurim, and they say this sort of. So I still don't understand it today, but it just gives you an idea of the reach. Okay? Now, in 1933, Stalin wanted diplomatic relations with Russia, as I said, with the USA. He got it. They even persuaded an American diplomat, William Christian Bullitt, a very famous WASP guy, diplomat from Philadelphia. He said, it'll be a golden future if America makes diplomatic relations with Russia. The sky's the limit. It'll open up Russia. The two countries are the largest in the world. They have so much creativity with each other. It's a great place. Yeah, so Roosevelt made him the ambassador to Russia. In about 15 minutes, he realized what's really going on, and then he switched 180 degrees. Here's the Bullitt over here. He's singing a different song. This was a great advocate of American relations with Russia.
The communists are red fascists. Soviet imperialism has replaced Nazi imperialism as a threat to the peace of the world. Hitler never succeeded in building up in the countries he intended to conquer instruments so powerful as Stalin's communist parties and their associated fellow travelers. Stalin will not stop of his own volition. He can only be stopped.
Now, by the way, when he said that, Roosevelt fired him. He moved him from Moscow to Paris, is what he did. So I'm just trying to show you, again, the atmosphere of that time. So I'm going to be telling you stuff tonight, which is not the usual thing you see in the history book. Now, the point I'm trying to make is like this. The Russian agents, therefore, were interested in creating bad relations between the U.S. and Japan. That's a classic Stalinist policy. I have three people, you kill each other, I'll take over. You understand? And he did succeed to a great degree in the long run. Okay? He was the big victor of World War II. The Russian agents work to create bad relations between USA and Japan. They did the same thing between China and Japan. The two Oriental countries have clashing nationalism, Japanese nationalism, Chinese nationalism. The Russians fanned all this. The Japanese militarists were too obtuse to realize that they're playing Stalin's game. And so they went to war with China in 1937, and they didn't realize who's really going to benefit in the end. They'll knock out Chiang Kai-shek, they got Mao Zedong, to use simple language. The cause of China, I told you before, was always had a lot of emotional traction. Remember Pearl Buck, right? And the Good Earth and all that sort of thing. Oh, the wonderful Chinese, America has to be on their side. Herbert Hoover was out of office. He warned against emotionalism, but it didn't matter. Now, the Japanese got into a big war with China in the late 1930s, and they behaved horribly. Okay? There was a local brawl that turned into a full-fledged war, and the Japanese, the rape of Nanking, I think everybody's heard of. I can't show you pictures of it. It's too horrible. But I think there's a famous, they bayoneted the pregnant women, all that sort of thing. I mean, Japanese behave like behemoths. And as I say before, they have, it'll take me too much time. They have a racist attitude. They say, don't waste. This is what I'm telling you what they say now in the interviews. The old veterans, they say, we didn't want to waste bullets on the chinks. So we just use it to stab them. This is what you're talking about. China fights back proudly, but unsuccessfully. They can never match the Japanese military. Chiang Kai-shek will never make peace. And little by little, more and more Japs go into China. It becomes their Vietnam, so to speak. How to get out of it. Stalin is having a grand old time. This is Gavaldic, China think we're wiping each other out. They're too dumb. The Japs don't realize that they're dancing to Stalin's tune. Chiang Kai-shek does realize that, simply because he had been sent earlier in the 1920s to Russia to see if there could be cooperation between Sun Yat-sen, if you know who that is, he realized exactly what's going on at that time, and they kidnapped his son. They wouldn't let him out till 1937. Right? That's who Stalin is. So he understood, but the Americans didn't. By the late 1930s, Stalin anticipates a war with Hitler. He doesn't want a two-front war, fighting Germany and fighting Japan. He doesn't want to do that. In 1939, Japanese officers improvidently stick their nose into Russian territory. They say this really belongs to Manchuria. And Stalin sent his top general, Zhukov, became the famous marshal later on, with hundreds of tanks. Here, the Japanese made a movie out of this, right? And you'll just see as I go on. And he gave them a bloody nose because he put a big train and like 500 tanks on there. And Japanese didn't have the kind of Soviet tanks. And they destroyed They destroyed the Japanese forces over there. As a result, Japan backed off, and Stalin backed off because Stalin said, I guess I don't want to get involved in the war with Japan. I got to worry about Germany. Do you know when this is taking place, what you're seeing over here? What they call the Battle of Kolingol? The day Hitler invaded Poland. People don't realize. So one of the reasons Stalin doesn't go into Poland for 2 weeks afterwards is because he's finishing fighting the wars against the Japanese. So you need a scorecard to keep track of everything I'm talking about over here, right? The world was going nuts at that time. Okay? Now, all the Americans said is like this. Thank God it's not here. It's Meshuggah over there, all the rest of it. The same way you and I say today, there's a war in Africa, there's a war over here. Who can keep track of all this business? Now, Stalin wants to push Japan into a war against America to get Japan off his back and let the U.S. weaken his Asiatic foe. His agents in the Roosevelt administration portray Japan in the blackest colors. They play upon America's anger in Japan's war in China, but Roosevelt was not interested in a war with Japan. Like Stalin, Roosevelt was focused on Hitler, who he saw was a real threat. The Germans could invade America, they're so good. The Japanese, in his mind, they can't do so. Which brings us to the highest placed Russian agent that I know about in the Roosevelt administration, a starry-eyed idealist, and this was Harry Dexter White, who was number 2 at the Treasury Department. There's Morgenthau, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of Treasury. Henry Morgenthau was Jewish, of course. Henry Morgenthau was Roosevelt's next-door neighbor in the farm back in the West Dutchess County, Hyde Park, right? He was not 100%, 200% loyal to Roosevelt, which is one of the reasons he made him Secretary of Treasury. And Roosevelt wanted to show that he's not anti-Semitic. You understand? No, he actually was a social friend with the Morgenthau. It's an interesting relationship. Morgenthau came from a super assimilated family. They didn't have a Pesach Seder. You know, no, they were super. So forth, although his wife was Jewish. It's interesting. And Morgenthau didn't know much about being secretary. He didn't know when Roosevelt appointed him Secretary of Treasury. It's not like he came from Wall Street. He didn't know anything about money. In fact, Dorothy Parker, I think it was, said very famously, he says, Roosevelt has accomplished the impossible. He's appointed Treasury Department, the only Jew in the world who doesn't know about money. But over the course of time, he put together a staff. Now there's this guy, Harry Weiss, from Boston, from Litvish parents, who born in Boston, grew up over there. And again, from not a religious family. And he was in World War I a little bit. And afterwards, he wouldn't have a career. His father had a hardware store, successful hardware store. And when he grew up, he was in the hardware store for a couple of years. After a while, he said, I don't like the hardware store. He wanted to get an academic career. So by the time it's all over, he ended up getting a PhD, I think, from Columbia, I believe, in economics, I think it was. And they ended up teaching at a little college somewhere in Wisconsin or one of those places. And the New Deal, like I told you, they brought in all these guys. And there was a Jewish economist named Jacob Viner who worked for FDR. And they said, we just need guys that understand currency and international monetary stuff. And this guy had written a book on it or whatever. And so they brought him in, and then he rose little by little. He was a starry-eyed idealist. He thought that Russia is the best place in the world. And he never was there. He thought they've got it worked out perfectly. He even wrote, he wouldn't take money for spying. It's Lishma. He says, he he wrote them treatises how they can reform their own money and how to improve their economy. But nobody knew this, of course, unless you were a communist. In Roosevelt, he was a very successful and very accomplished economist and a very important official in the Treasury Department who did a lot of great things for the United States of America. Okay, let's be clear about this. He was an important official because he did a lot. And he became the right-hand man of Morgenthau, whatever his official position was, but he took orders from abroad. And in 1940, 41, they tell him like this: you tell your guys, you tell Morgenthau, because you control Morgenthau, because Morgenthau wasn't a very smart guy, relied on his staff. As you tell him, Japan is like Hitler, Japan is like Hitler, Japan is like Hitler, and it's a terrible threat, and America should, be very strong against him and all the rest of it. Now, this is not the only reason that the U.S. got involved in the clash with Japan, but it's one of the important reasons. There are even people now who have written books on this. They push it a little bit too far, but if you're at all interested in the subject, here's one called Operation Snow. How a Soviet mole in the White House triggered Pearl Harbor. That's a little bit of too much. But nevertheless, there's more to it than people would like to admit. And you always have to ask yourself the question, cui bono, who's benefiting by all this sort of thing. I can just say this: by 1940, Morgenthau said, Harry White is my foreign minister. I mean, he's the guy in charge of our foreign policy. He gives me all the advice. So here you have a guy working for the other side at the peak of the administration. Anyway, we know that Boris Baikov, who was the head of the NKVD, what you today would call the KGB in America, used to meet with him at these restaurants in Washington and give him the orders. And the situation, by the time I'm getting in, as I'm coming near to the end, increasing tension by the time we get 1940, 41, because Japan, of course, proceeds obtusely to make a treaty with the Axis, with Hitler. There's Hitler, and there's Matsuoka, the guy we saw before who walked out of the League of Nations. You see Matsuoka, the Japanese foreign minister. And Japanese thought, they're doing a smart idea. I mean, Germany's against Russia, this help us balance against Russia. They didn't understand, and they really didn't, the Nazi stuff. The way Nazism drove people in the Anglo-Saxon countries crazy, the evil that Hitler represented. Tim is a dictator in Germany, there's a dictator in Russia, a dictator all over the place. They saw it as another country. This, I think, was one of their very great mistakes. And when they signed a treaty with Hitler, that was a red flag for Roosevelt. Because he's like, we're going to be attacked on two sides. Germany on one side, Japan on the other side. Now, the Japanese weren't necessarily thinking that way, but it doesn't matter. And they don't realize, Matsuoka certainly didn't realize, that it makes the Americans think he's a Hitler. Look at this. When he came back, he met with a bunch of Jewish businessmen in Japan, and he said, I'm the man responsible for the alliance of Hitler, but nowhere have I promised we would carry out anti-Semitic policies. This is not my opinion, it's the opinion of Japan. And I have no compunction in announcing it to the world. In other words, this is strictly politics with international geographical maneuvering. We're not anti-Semitic, and they weren't. We're not going against it. We're not going to do like Hitler sort of thing. Yeah, but the Americans and the other side, I guess, you say that, but really it's baloney. And really you're an arm of the Nazis. That's what you've turned yourself into that. And as long as you're out there with Hitler, you're a traifus as far as we're concerned. Which makes, from a Jewish point of view,